Right then. Well, thank you all for coming, and thank you very much for inviting me. This is a version of a talk that I gave originally at Oxenmoot this past year. Um, I don't know if any of you were present, but I've been invited to come and talk to you about some of the work that we've been doing on the Oxford English Dictionary. Um, some of you probably know, a lot of you probably know, that Tolkien spent 2 years working on the Oxford English Dictionary after the First World War and before he obtained a position at Leeds in 1920 as a reader in the English language. And some of you probably also know that he would later say that he, quote, learned more in those 2 years than in any equal period of my life. Now, if you're not familiar with Tolkien's work as a lexicographer, there is already a very good book about it. It's called The Ring of Words by a few of my colleagues, which talks about the words that Tolkien worked on and the ways in which his training as a philologist and lexicographer would go on to inform his later writings. This is not going to be that talk. This is a talk about Tolkien's influence on the Oxford English Dictionary, but not through entries he himself worked on. Rather, it's about Tolkien's lasting influence on the English language, and especially on the language used in fantasy fiction. So, I am an editor and lexicographer at the Oxford English Dictionary, and I work primarily on the new words team, researching and drafting new entries. But my academic background was in Old Norse Icelandic poetry. And so I also spend some of my working time with the etymology team. And this is how, almost precisely 2 years into my own tenure as a new lexicographer on the OED, and in one of those, honestly, in one of those, pinch me, what has happened to my life sort of moments, I found myself as one of the new words drafters, but also as the assigned etymologist for a whole range of words, beginning with the letters ELF and ELV and WIZ. Yes, we finally revised and updated the Elves and Wizards of the OED. Now, if you had looked at them before, you might have noticed they were in need of updates. Our entries for elf and elfish, just to give you the idea, were first published in a fascicle of the OED in the late 1800s and had not been substantially revised since. Wizard was first published a bit later in the early 1900s, but also had not been substantially revised since. So, today we're going to look at some of the elves and wizards of the OED, and we're going to look at what has been added and what has changed, and in particular, how Tolkien's lasting influence on our vocabulary is now reflected in these entries. And we have to start with Elven. In the first edition of the Oxford English Dictionary, in a volume published in 1897, this was the entirety of the entry for Elven. Elven, OBS, obsolete, i.e., no longer in use. We get the Old English and Middle English forms of the noun. There is no mention here of an adjective, and a selection of quotations ranging from approximately 1100 to 1314. All of the adjectival evidence is over at the entry elfin, ELFIN, where our earliest evidence comes not from Old or Middle English, but from Spenser's Faerie Queene, and we get sense 1 pertaining to elves of elfish nature or origin, and examples from writers like Keats and Carlyle. And we have sense 2a, diminutive, dwarfish, and 2b, fairy-like, full of strange charm. Now, in order to understand why these entries looked the way they did, I'm going to need to explain a little bit about the principles underlying the Oxford English Dictionary, principles that apply equally well to these old entries from 1897 and to new ones published in 2025 or 2026. The Oxford English Dictionary is fundamentally a historical dictionary. It documents how any given word has been used by English speakers and writers over the course of history. I'm going to let you in on a secret. This runs a bit contrary to how many people think of dictionaries. We do not sit down as editors and decide this is how this word ought to be used. No. Instead, we try and look at as much evidence as possible across many different sources, many different time periods, and we record how the word has been used and is being used. And then we try and write a definition that is a succinct summary of the most typical use. So this explains how, for example, words like irregardless and literally, meaning not literally, but figuratively, end up in the OED. Lots of people think they are non-standard or incorrect. But equally, if lots of people have in fact been using them as words to mean something for hundreds of years, we are bound to document that historical fact. It's a bit like writing a short biography, except instead of writing the life story of a person, who their parents were, when they were born, what they did, what major events happened in their lifetime, that sort of thing, we're writing the life story of a word. And the editors of the OED back in 1897 were doing the same thing, looking at the evidence they had for elfin and elven, and trying to explain, explain the history of where a word came from and what happened to it over time, and then B, sum up the most typical uses of the word in a concise entry and definition. Now, obviously, the most typical uses of these words in 1897 were not the same as they are now. This will not come as a surprise to anyone here, given that J.R.R. Tolkien was all of 5 years old in 1897. Some of you might be familiar with the work of Tom Shippey or Dimitri Fimi, amongst others, who have written in some detail about how Tolkien's concept of elves in his fiction gradually diverged from the diminutive fairies common in Victorian literature in the 1800s. And if you have read Tolkien's essay on fairy stories, you may recall this part of his commentary on the OED's definition at the time of the word fairy. As for diminutive size, I do not deny that the notion is a leading one in modern use. I have often thought that it would be interesting to try to find out how that has come to be so, but my knowledge is not sufficient for a certain answer. Of old, there were indeed some inhabitants of fairy that were small, though hardly diminutive, but smallness was not characteristic of that people as a whole. The diminutive being, elf or fairy, is, I guess, in England, largely a sophisticated product of literary fancy. And he goes on to explain in quite some detail how much he finds this tiresome. Now, the OED's editors in 1897 had been bound, to the best of their ability, to document exactly that, the main, typical, leading uses of any given word in 1897. We are equally bound to do that today. And that means that the modern versions of these entries have changed rather substantially. So let's look at the life story of elven. The first thing you have to understand about elven is that the Old English evidence for this word is fairly scarce. Old English for the evidence for the word elf is also fairly scarce. And if we got into all of the philological complexities, we could be here for several hours. Suffice it to say that we do not have unambiguous evidence to answer questions even as seemingly simple as, what was the grammatical gender of these words in Old English? We don't have anything close to a full paradigm. And it's also not always unambiguously clear whether a particular inflected form in Old English should be understood as a form of the word elven or as a genitive plural form of elf itself. It is usually assumed that elven is a feminine noun because of the feminine gender of the Latin words that are being glossed, and because there is an en suffix in Old English that forms a number of other feminine nouns, seemingly including this one. But we cannot be 100% sure. The earliest evidence that we have is from glossaries. which give us, a list of Latin words and a list of Old English glosses. So there are some of them on screen: nymphs, elfini; dryads, woodoo elfin or wood elvens; naiads, sea elfin, sea elvens, and so forth. And then we also get examples in Middle English of something that is not exactly an adjective and is probably really the genitive plural of the noun in the phrase Elvenland, the land of the Elvens, or the land of the elves. And then we have to fast forward many hundreds of years to the 1930s, because it's extremely difficult to pin down an exact date at which Tolkien switches from using elfin with an F to elven with a V. Christopher Tolkien, in the History of Middle-earth volumes that many of you are probably quite familiar with, often silently corrects the former to the latter, in keeping with his father's later practice. So an example with it that has elven in it from, say, the Lay of Lothian in the Lays of Beleriand is not entirely unambiguous evidence of an early date for the OED's purposes. And one thing that you sort of have to understand about the OED is that we have to be very, very sure of our dates. So if we claim that a certain word was in use at a certain date, we want to be 100% sure that we have the evidence to back that up, right? Christopher Tolkien's notes in the History of Middle-earth make it clear that often a particular typescript is dated. But then his father had gone back in and made corrections, changing, say, elfin to elven. But these corrections are handwritten over the top of the typescript, and they aren't necessarily themselves dated. And so we can't be entirely sure when exactly they were done. And if you're wondering why some of these entries that I'm going to show you in the next few minutes don't start with evidence from the Lay of Lothian, that is why. And it wasn't from lack of trying to pin it down. At one point, I think we had half a dozen editors all discussing the dating issue and trying to work out what we could and couldn't be sure of. But at some point in the late 1920s or early 1930s, Tolkien makes the shift to elven with a V, but initially not as a standalone adjective. So if you remember in Middle English, elvenland, where elvena is really probably not an adjective per se, but the genitive plural of the noun, many of elven's early appearances in Tolkien's works are as the first element in various types of compound. So in his notes on the translation of names in The Lord of the Rings, Tolkien himself would later describe elven as a, quote, archaic adjectival or composition form. And some of these compounds are in fact patterned themselves after Older Middle English, or have parallels in other Germanic languages. So elven fair, which he uses in early drafts of the Lay of Lothian, has a clear precedent in Old English elfscene. And we don't have to guess or try to construct an argument for Tolkien being aware of this. One of the songs of the philologists that Tolkien wrote in the 1920s is literally called Edis Elfscene, elf fair lady, woman as fair as an elf. And Tolkien references the Old English compound in a 1961 letter as one of the very few hints in Old English that elves were not entirely malignant creatures. Elf, he writes, we should suppose to be associated only with rheumatism, toothache, and nightmares, if it were not for the occurrence of elfscene, elven fair, applied to Sarah and Judith, and a few glosses, such as dryads, woodoo elfin. Now, elven itself has Germanic parallels, of course. Middle Dutch and Middle Low German both have the similarly formed elvin, and we also find elbin, E-L-B-I-N, as early as 1545 in early modern German. But the period in the late 1920s, early 1930s, it's very, very difficult to pin down the exact date at which Tolkien makes the transition. By the time The Hobbit is published, we are on much firmer ground with the dates in English. So by the time we have The Hobbit, we have elven, with a V, as an element in a variety of other compounds, like elven harps and the Elvenking of Mirkwood. Elvenking, of course, also has a Germanic precedent that Tolkien could have been aware of. Elfenkönig in German dates back at least as far as 1780. And Elfenking, with an F, does go back to at least the 1800s in English. The earliest evidence we could find, though, of Elvenking is the first edition of The Hobbit. But the Elven King said, "Long will I tarry, ere I begin this war for gold." Now, you will notice in some of these examples that while the quotation paragraph starts with Tolkien, it certainly doesn't end with Tolkien. In 2025 or 2026, researching an OED entry for elf or elven means looking not just at Middle English poetry or Victorian fairy stories, but at hundreds and thousands and tens of thousands of examples from, say, fantasy novel writers, role-playing game writers, fan fiction writers, fantasy songwriters, and yes, fantasy enthusiasts on every corner of the internet and from every corner of the globe, and looking at what they mean when they talk about elves and elven kings and Elvenland and elvish tongues. And of course, what we see happen over the course of the 20th century is that Tolkien's works become enormously popular, and his ideas about elves and what they're like becomes enormously influential, and so does the language that he uses to talk about them. We do eventually get elven as a standalone adjective in Tolkien's own works. So here's what the entirely new adjective branch of the word looks like in the OED now. You can see that we start with the Fellowship of the Ring, in Eldamar beside the walls of Elventirion. And when we look at typical modern use of elven as an adjective, or as an element in compounds, in the 21st century, it's certainly not all references to Tolkien. It becomes, especially from the 1970s onwards, widespread across fantasy fiction, tabletop role-playing games, video games, even in contexts where the elves being referred to are not particularly Tolkienian. Tolkien doesn't have quite the same influence on the form of a word with elf itself. The plural form, which is spelled elves rather than elfs, E-L-F-S, is used by authors like Shakespeare and Pope, amongst others. Forming the plural with a V is very well established before Tolkien's time. But in bringing elf itself up to date, we've also cited Tolkien at a number of senses where it's relevant, as well as more recent fantasy authors. So let me show you one of the new senses in our entry for elf, which is on screen now, with modifying word. A type of elf that is associated with a specified characteristic or natural feature, or inhabits a particular domain, usually depicted as belonging to a distinct race, group, or clan, as in dark elf, light elf, mountain elf, and so on and so forth. This concept of different types of elves associated with particular domains has precedent in Old English glosses and in Old Norse Icelandic Ljósalfr and Dökkalfr. But much of the evidence in the 1700s and the 1800s is people talking about the Old English and Old Norse sources. The rise in popularity of this type of formation after the publication of Tolkien's work is really quite noticeable. There the light elves and the deep elves and the sea elves lived for ages and grew fairer and wiser and more learned, says the narrator of The Hobbit. And of course, now we have moon elves and sun elves and water elves and elves of many sorts of domains that Tolkien himself never referred to, but which other fantasy authors have invented along those lines and with that precedent. So I'm going to detour from Elven a little bit further to talk about some of the other new additions. Elvenking and Elvenland are sufficiently well established that we've added them as headwords in their own right. But there are a number of other closely related words that have been popularized by Tolkien's work that we've also added as part of these revisions. So, High Elf, for example. Now, part of the job, the basic part of my job as a new words editor, when drafting and researching a new entry, is to do our absolute best to find the earliest evidence that we possibly can. Now, the earliest evidence we can find for High Elf, which will come as a surprise to nobody here, comes from Tolkien, although it is now widely used by other authors. Now, some of you will be looking at this entry and thinking, what about the Hobbit? They are old swords, very old swords of the High Elves of the West, my kin, says Elrond in Rivendell to Bilbo Baggins, discussing the blades found in the troll lair. So you remember how I said earlier that we have to be very sure of our dates at the OED. If we quote something from the first edition of The Hobbit, published in 1937, we do have to send somebody to check an actual first edition of The Hobbit from 1937 to be sure that the word appears in that first edition. High Elf does not. It appears in the third edition, published in the 1960s, but in the 1937 version, Elrond is still talking about gnomes, not High Elves. The first published example of High Elf that we can find comes from the Fellowship of the Ring in 1954. These are High Elves. They spoke the name of Elbereth, says Frodo. But, of course, we know Tolkien was using it earlier, and very, very helpfully, we have the letters, which were published later, posthumously, but they are nonetheless clearly dated. And if you look through the letters, you will find one from 1944, in which Tolkien is talking about the dominion of men, and writes, Elrond is gone, and all the High Elves. Tolkien's work might provide the first evidence we have for this compound, but later writers of novels and games alike have adopted it wholeheartedly. So our later evidence is chosen for its typicality. Some of you might be familiar with Elaine Cunningham, author of many Forbidden Realms novels, including the 1991 Elf Shadow, or have played the Elder Scrolls Online, which is referenced in the 2018 quotation on screen. Writing a definition for a new entry like this one, for High Elf, also means trying to capture the most typical 21st century use, which might not always be identical to how Tolkien himself used it. So we say that High Elves are typically, not always, but typically, characterized as tall, beautiful, noble, and as having magical or mystical qualities or abilities. Now, given that Tolkien in one of his letters writes about Galadriel being, quote, obliged to remonstrate with the hobbits over their confused use of the word magic, I'm not sure he himself would have wanted to call them magical, per se. But it is certainly something that later writers and role players have picked up and run with. Kymel in Elf Shadow is an archmage of substantial skill, whose people have a particular gift for magic. While if you've ever played a high elven character in any of the various editions of Dungeons and Dragons, a certain aptitude for magic is also often baked into the very mechanics of the game. This is not the only entry that has needed some serious work. So the OED's original entry for Elvish, meanwhile, has also had some work done. So this is the original entry for Elvish from the 1800s. There is no mention of a noun, Elvish, a land used by elves, in either the first or second edition of the OED. This is entirely new part of speech. And again, we have a situation where the earliest published examples come from the Lord of the Rings. But we know, thanks to the clearly dated letters, that Tolkien was using it at least a decade earlier. We give both in the entry. Examples from The Lord of the Rings are relevant to the history of these words because they are influential on later writers, whereas the examples from the letters demonstrate that Tolkien was using them earlier, even though they hadn't yet appeared in a published text. Now, I've talked a lot about elves, so just for comparison's sake, let's take a very quick look at wizard, because I've shown you quite a few examples now where the earliest evidence we can find for the entry, or a particular sense, is from Tolkien's works. Obviously, elvish, noun, a language used by elves. Our first quotation is one of the letters, and the first example that was actually published is we've got the Two Towers. Wizard gives us a bit of a contrast. So we now cite Tolkien in our entry for Wizard, but the sense long predates him. So this is the updated version of Sense 2a. Originally, a man versed in arcane arts and knowledge. In later use, a person, typically a man, regarded or recognized as having innate or learned occult powers, and who was a practitioner of magic. One of the notes that accompanies this entry highlights the fact that after the late 17th century, wizards are chiefly characters of imaginative literature, and it talks about some of the common traits that they typically have. Now, we've brought this entry up to date. We've added typical quotation evidence over the past century, including in this case Tolkien, Pratchett, Rothfuss. But use of wizard in this sense long predates Tolkien, as you can see. Now, let's go back to the elves for one moment, because I have to talk about our new entry for elvendom. Sometimes the research process for this job turns up things you did not expect. The first quotation that we could find of anyone using elvendom, spelled E-L-V-E-N-D-O-M, is not in fact Tolkien. It is a local Hertfordshire newspaper, a writer who is talking about place names associated with elves, goblins, and sprites, and so forth. Now, it's dated 1944. It's a newspaper column published in 1944. This is after the publication of The Hobbit, but before The Lord of the Rings. And we have no indication, we have no idea, and no way of determining whether or not the writer was familiar with Tolkien's works, whether there was influence there. What's really interesting about this quotation in particular is that the headline writer, the author of the headline of the article, uses elfendom, E-L-F-I-N-D-O-M, whereas the writer, the article in the article itself uses the spelling with V-E-N. That's a bit of an outlier. It is the earliest we can possibly find. There's then a bit of a gap. Then we get, of course, what everyone here will be familiar with, the locus classicus, Tolkien in The Fellowship of the Ring, Aragorn speaking in Caras Galadhon to Frodo, "Here is the heart of elvendom on earth, and here my heart dwells ever, unless there be a light beyond those dark roads that we still must tread, you and I." And then it continues. Tolkien might not be the first example, but Tolkien is probably the most influential example, undoubtedly, in this paragraph. Our later examples in this entry show a number of slightly different strands of meaning. So you have examples that show, elves collectively versus a realm in which elves live versus, the domain or world of elves. They're all very, very similar in meaning, but there are very fine shades of distinctions there that we've illustrated with the quotations. Now, I need to give you all time for questions and discussions. And before we do that, we need to circle back to Elven itself, because there is one more part of this life story to share with you. You will recall that I said that Elven in Old and Middle English was a noun, and then it fell out of use. Obsolete, said the 1897 OED entry. Elfin, with an F, became the standard. Tolkien, as we've seen, adopts elven as an archaic adjectival and composition form, using it in compounds and then as a standalone adjective. Other fantasy writers take this up. And then another thing happens. Tolkien doesn't use elven as a noun. We have no evidence for Tolkien himself talking about the elvens as a people. But after the popularization of the adjective in fantasy fiction and role-playing and video games and so forth, the noun comes back too. So here's the updated entry for the noun, an elf, especially in early use, a female elf. In Middle English, the word appears to denote an elf of either sex, reformed in the late 20th century, probably after use as an adjective. The obsolete label has disappeared, There is a gap of a good 600 years there before it reemerges. And we have a note, reformed in the late 20th century, probably after use as an adjective. Tolkien is nowhere cited in this particular quotation paragraph because he doesn't himself use elven as a noun. You had informed the elvens at the High Council, writes Terry Brooks in the Elfstones of Shannara, several years after Tolkien's death. But I think it's very safe to say that it's quite unlikely that Terry Brooks and later fantasy writers would have come back to it were it not for the popularization of the adjective. And for that, we must give some thanks to one J.R.R. Tolkien. So congratulations, authors and readers of fantasy. You have collectively resurrected a 1,000-year-old word from beyond the grave after it had been dead and buried for about 600 years. And with that, I'm very happy to take any questions. What's the best way of doing that? If people are online and want to pop them in the chat, let me see if I can see the chat. Or is it easier well, if anyone's in the room that could pass questions on, I'm very happy to answer whatever works best.
Yes, well, I don't know if we have any questions in the audience or online, but if you do have, yes, please.
I'm a bit curious about, for example, the word hobbit. I know in D&D they use halfling due to copyright issues. How has that played into the definitions? Rewriting of the definitions.
Yeah, so Hobbit is a slightly different situation. We are working on Hobbit. Let me just double check if yes, okay, we've actually the last time we have also just revised Hobbit, so I can say a little bit about that one. It has the updated version of that has now been published. Obviously with Elf and Elven, they weren't copyrighted. They date back, hundreds of years before Tolkien. You can't really copyright a word in that way. So fantasy writers and gamers and so forth have been very free to pick up and run with them. For things like Hobbit, it has been a bit more difficult, right? Because or for terms like Balrog, for example, where I think D&D had to go with Balor or Balor, or or Ents. There's various versions of D&D that go with Treants, or various other things. And so if you talk about Ents or Balrogs or Hobbits, people do still quite often associate that with Tolkien rather than using it more generically. Yes, those lost, I believe in the very earliest version of D&D, they tried to use Hobbit, and then they got a lawsuit from someone connected with the Tolkien estate, and then they had to stop using them. And yes, there is less sort of generic use of those terms as a result. In the case of Hobbit, there is still some generic use because, Hobbit can mean at this point quite a few different things. It's been used as the nickname of, a particular humanoid whose remains were discovered on an Indonesian island. When people talk about, hobbit holes or hobbit homes, they don't necessarily mean an actual literal hobbit hole in the Lord of the Rings. Sometimes they mean, a particularly cozy home or a home with architecture that resembles a hobbit home in the Lord of the Rings, with round doors or, particular features, or, being particularly cozy in some way. So we do see that sort of, broader use that has come about more recently. And yes, that is documented in the revised entry for Hobbit. That absolutely has affected, the revisions that we've made. Does that answer the question?
That does answer.
How about other synonyms for wizard, like warlock or sorcerer or magician, or kind of uses this or those, or Is that all words too, or?
So I wouldn't expect as much influence from Tolkien on something like Warlock. It's not something that Tolkien uses as much in his writings. They are very old words. Warlock goes back to Old English, and in the revised entry, we do cite, obviously it's now quite widespread in fantasy fiction, novels, role-playing games. So that has also been updated fairly recently, and we do have a number of citations from modern authors. It's not one that shows the same sort of significant Tolkienian influence as something like elf or elven would.
What wizard?
Pardon?
Sorry, I'm thinking warlock, wizard, sorcerer.
Sorcerer. Let me just check that one. Where are we at with that? Sorcerer still needs some revision. So the process of revising the OED is a very long process. It took them nearly 100 years to write the first version, the first edition, and sort of the revisions for the third edition are ongoing. Sorcerer was first published in 1913. 1913. And we have not yet fully revised it. That is still on a to-do list. So watch this space. If you ask me that question in a few years, I might be able to answer. But at the moment, that is still on a to-do list.
Well, this might fall in the same category then. Necromancer? Is Necromancer in the same category? That it being revised, or?
Necromancer was last looked at in 2003, so reasonably recently by OED standards. But obviously that's still 20 years ago now. Yeah, it has been brought somewhat more up to date. Yeah, the last revision of that was 2003.
If I might just quickly put it back to the word hobbit, and it's really like, I read somewhere that the guest Tolkien had picked up the word itself from something published back in 1895. Denim tract, something like that. Is that anything familiar, or is it?
Yeah, so there is an isolated use of hobbit in. So there's a folklorist named M.A. Denham who compiled this long list of supernatural beings, and writes in 1853, the whole earth was so overrun with ghosts, boggles, bogies, red men, portunes, grants, hobbits, hobgoblins, etc. Yes, hobbit appears in that text. We don't know what he meant by it. Denham does not give any source for the word, and we can't find any other occurrence. So we don't know whether Tolkien was familiar with Denham's use. Is the honest answer to that question. None of Denham's other unusual words appear in Tolkien's works. So we don't know. I've got to be honest. But yes, there is an earlier occurrence from 1853.
Right.
Whether or not Tolkien was aware of it, I cannot say.
Might that kind of affect, say, the trademark of the word, if you will? That might not be the correct description, but like that Tolkien estate seems to have a claim on the word hobbit, but since it was someone had used it before, then that might not be enough.
I don't know. I'm not an expert in copyright law. So I think that's probably outside the scope of my particular specialty. We do have one isolated example, but then basically nothing until Tolkien.
Thank you.
I got there a bit late, so it could be that you mentioned this, But how do you go about choosing which quotes you use from a book?
That's a really good question, actually. So it varies a little bit depending on whether it's the earliest quotation or whether it's one of the later quotations. So let me go back and find a slide where I've got some examples. Let's yeah, we'll look at some of the examples in this will do. So for the earliest quotation in a quotation paragraph, it is always the earliest thing we can find, full stop. You know, the earliest example that we can find that we can reliably date goes in the entry. We as editors do not get, you know, a judgment call or a choice or a, you know, the earliest thing that we can find that we can reliably date goes in the entry. Because we are fundamentally trying to document the history of the language, the earliest date that we can, you know, reliably establish is extremely relevant information for the history of the word. The later quotations are a bit different. So when you're selecting later quotations, you are trying to select examples that are representative of the most typical use. So we do a lot of things like looking at corpora, which are large databases of texts, and, you know, what sort of common collocates, what sort of other words are commonly used with this particular word. We do a lot of, you know, reading lots and lots and lots of examples and trying to find something that is, you know, quite representative and quite typical of common use. We would, you know, in some cases, if there is a particular quotation that is, you know, very, very strongly associated with a given word, we might include that even if it's not the earliest. So obviously with the case of, where is it? Elvendom. Okay, here is the heart of elvendom on earth is not the earliest quotation we could find, but how would you write an entry for this word and leave out that part of the story? I mean, you know, Tolkien's use of it there is, you know, sufficiently influential that we would almost be remiss not to. Whereas for the more modern 21st century examples, you know, we are looking for, you know, examples that are typical of modern use. So if it's commonly used in fantasy novels, I will look at examples from fantasy novels. If it's commonly used in role-playing games or video games, that's where I'm looking. You know, I might look at, if I'm trying to get examples from, you know, fantasy fans, enthusiasts, people who talk about this regularly, I might look on social media, sites like Threads or Blue Sky or X, or, you know, Reddit, Threads, wherever, right, to try and get examples. When I was drafting, what was it? Headcanon. Sorry, this is a bit of a divergence, but when I was drafting the entry for headcanon, I spent quite a lot of time looking back through like Tumblr and LiveJournal, trying to find examples. You know, you try and assess how it is typically used and who it's typically used by, and then you go and look at examples there and try and select ones that are representative of, you know, the most typical modern use. Does that help?
So I have two questions. First, when you are looking at modern uses and adequate uses of words today, you have large digital databases that you can skim through, and you can find probably the earliest version just by searching for it. But how did Tolkien or the lexicographers in the pre-digital age search for old words? Did they just know every text by heart, or how did
No. So we are enormously fortunate in the 21st century to have, yes, digital databases where many, many, many things are digitized. Not everything. We do have a small army of library researchers who get sent out to actually check actual physical texts and, you know, it is quite common, even in my job, to have to go to the library and consult, particular works. But for the most part, yes, we can do quite a lot of research online. In Tolkien's day, and at the beginning of the Oxford English Dictionary, quotations for the dictionary were collected by a very early form of crowdsourcing. So there was a call put out in the 1800s to volunteer readers who were asked to note down useful quotations from the reading on little slips of paper. And they sent these slips of paper to the OED offices in their millions and millions and millions. And part of the job of creating an OED entry in the 1800s or the 1900s was to sort through these slips of paper with quotation evidence that had been sent in by volunteers. You could ask your volunteers to go and read and look for examples of this particular word, and then some months or years later you would get bundles of quotations on slips sent back to you. And part of the job was to sort those and to put them in order, and then to select ones that were appropriate for the entry, and to, the one with the earliest date, and so on and so forth. For certain texts, like the Bible or Shakespeare, in some cases there were concordances available. So if something had been concordanced, i.e. it was possible to go and look at all of the appearances of a particular word in a particular text because somebody had created a concordance for it, which at the time was a very manual and time-consuming process. So only happened for texts that people were, quite invested in working on. Then, the OED editors could go and look at those concordances and find examples of those words in, say, Shakespeare or a particular book of the Bible. But it was a much more laborious process, and it was, much harder to be sure of a first date, right? When we go back now and try to revise old entries, we often find that we can find earlier evidence now, because we have much more powerful ways of searching for it, and because so much is digitized. Yeah, in the early versions, it was literally slips of paper by, thousands upon thousands of volunteers who, donated their free time to read books and newspaper clippings and send examples to the OED.
So, thank you. One more question, if I may.
Go ahead.
For the elf variant words, you cited Old Dutch or Nether German sources, but I don't think you mentioned Old Norse, or did you? Because that is quite often used in Old Norse.
Yes. So I think I was specifically referencing, let me find Elven. Right. So elf, yes, obviously for elf in particular, there is a obvious Old Norse cognate in many Germanic languages, in fact. For elven, with with the VEN or elfin, FIN ending, there isn't an obvious similarly formed Old Norse word in exactly the same way. We do have similarly formed Middle Dutch, elvin, Middle Low German, elvin, and early modern German. We don't have a parallel form in Old Norse in that case. But for elf itself, ELF, yes, of course. Old Norse Icelandic elf, elfer, yes, that's there is a list of Germanic cognates. I think I could try and pull it up on screen actually if I could swap. Basically, yes. So at the etymology of elf itself, you have the Middle Dutch, the Old Saxon, the Middle Low German, the Old High German, the Middle High German, the German, the Icelandic, the Norwegian, the Swedish, the Danish, all of that, because there are cognates in so very many Germanic languages. If I can manage to swap screens for a second, I will pull up the actual etymology on screen. There we go. There's the cognates for elf. It's just where with elven itself, where we don't have a parallel formation, but we do in the Dutch and German. Any other questions?
I was kind of wondering, how does modern literature influence the uses of the different words? We talk about fantasy, but maybe other things like sci-fi or western or crime novels. Has been how big influence is modern literature on language today?
Yes, I mean, we certainly see many modern authors who are quite influential in shaping how people talk about certain subjects or use certain words. I'm not as familiar with the crime or mystery side of things. We certainly get lots of new words that come from science fiction. Let me see if I can think of some good examples off the top of my head. What have we drafted recently? I mean, something as straightforward as like smartwatch, I think, is originally sci-fi. Or no, I'm misremembering on that. Don't quote me on that. Certainly something like deep space or be a good example. Trying to think of things I've actually worked on recently.
Light speed, maybe?
Yeah, I mean, light speed. Okay, so light speed's a good example because obviously that has a very clear association with sci-fi now. The earliest use of that is actually just the speed of light, sort of, in the scientific sense, not in fiction per se. But obviously then, science fiction writers have adopted it, and there is a very, very common use to describe ships that travel at light speed or that sort of thing. Yeah, I mean, science fiction is definitely also very influential. I'm trying to think of examples off the top of my head, sorry.
Droid?
Pardon?
Droid? Star Wars.
Yeah, that was a good one. Yes, okay, that's a very good one. That is, yeah. We label that as originally and chiefly science fiction. And we've got evidence back to 1952, which, it sometimes, stuff will be popularized by a particular work and actually dates back earlier. So in this case, obviously you have to go back to early sci-fi, 50s sort of era, to find the earliest evidence. But then, yes, 1976, Star Wars, yes, that would be enormously influential on later use and on popularizing it.
Robot is interesting because that has changed a lot of meaning. That shifted a lot of meaning in all the years.
Sorry, I didn't quite catch all of that. Can you say that again?
The word robot, that word has changed a lot of meaning over the last or the 50, 70 or 80 years has been used. It was only mean as a slave human, I think. Was the real meaning.
So the original, the earliest use of that is again, yeah. So this is another good example where the earliest example we can find is a bit different than the later use. So I'd have to look into this quotation because I'll put it up on screen so that you can all see. So yeah, this is obviously chiefly science fiction now, and the earliest we could find when researching this is from a play, which is referencing mass-produced workers that had been assembled somehow. And we document that because it's the earliest example we can find. It's obviously not necessarily the typical use now. So obviously, if we then scroll down to some of the more recent evidence, you get examples that are much more along the lines of an artificial being typically made of metal.
So it sounds like you get to work on lots of fun and interesting words, being interested in fantasy literature. Are you allowed to just pick your own words, or do you get the stack on the table and you go to work, or how does this work?
That's an excellent question. So on the new words team, we have about 10 people. And we all have, different interests and different backgrounds and, different things that we know, that we have, specialties in or know stuff about. We will typically get assigned a list of words that as a team. So, I and a few other editors might get paired up in a small group, or we might just get as a team, I say like 10 of us, here is a list of things that need to be drafted or that we need to investigate drafting. And at that point, we do have a certain amount of freedom. You can put up your hand and say, ooh, that looks interesting. I'd like to work on that. And you can go and assign it to yourself and start working on it. Obviously, everything has to get done. So if we get, a spreadsheet of some number of words that all need to be drafted in the next 6 weeks, everything on that list has to get done. Or, at least somebody has to look into it. And if we decide not to do it, then we have a good reason for it. But everything has to be done. So you will end up working on some things that are very interesting and some things that are very strange and some things that you know nothing at all about. You might be working on a term from fantasy fiction one moment, and then economics, and then sports, and then a term from knitting or weaving or embroidery or figure skating or politics, or the subject matter varies enormously, is what I am saying. But you do have a certain amount of freedom. We sort out between ourselves as a team. If someone has a particular interest in a particular area, or if someone has particular strengths in a particular area where they have a particular knowledge of a relevant topic, we try and use the expertise that we have in the team. So, you can absolutely say, oh, that looks interesting. I would like to work on that. And you can go and decide it to yourself and do that. So there is a certain amount of freedom in that regard to work out between ourselves as editors who wants to work on what. Usually we don't have too many debates over who's doing what, because usually we have enough varied interests and backgrounds that we sort of divvy up the list between ourselves quite harmoniously. But yeah, we do have a certain amount of freedom in the everything has to get done, but if you have a particular interest in something, you can definitely put up your hand and volunteer to do it.
Yes, again.
Go ahead.
Have you looked into the work that Tolkien did on the dictionary? Was it any good?
Yes, it was. Yes. Yes. If you ever visit the OUP offices, you can see a bunch of the slips, like the handwritten slips that Tolkien actually wrote out and worked on when working on various different words. Tolkien was obviously enormously skilled at a very, very large number of Germanic languages and at etymology. So yes, he was very useful to the OED in the short period of time that he worked on it. Yes.